My brother only called when he needed something. I figured that out when I was 9 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway watching him charm money out of our mother's purse while she wasn't looking. He saw me watching. He winked. And somehow, even then, I knew that wink meant don't say a word or I'll make your life harder than it already is. His name is not important. What matters is that for 26 years, he was the sun our family orbited around. Louder than everyone, funnier than everyone, and somehow always the one who needed the most from everyone. My parents adored him the way some parents adore their most difficult child, not despite the trouble he caused, but almost because of it. Like the chaos he brought made life feel more alive. I was the quiet one, the one who got good grades and didn't make a fuss and picked up the slack when my brother disappeared for weeks at a time. My mother called me her rock. I didn't understand until much later that being someone's rock means they expect you to stay perfectly still while they stand on top of you. I moved out at 22, right after I finished my degree in business administration at Dalhousie. Halifax felt like a starting point, not a destination, and within 8 months I had packed everything I owned into a used Subaru and driven west to Calgary. I didn't have a job lined up. I had savings, a contact from a university career fair, and a deep, specific hunger to build something that was entirely mine. My parents thought I was being impulsive. My brother thought it was hilarious. He called me the night before I left and said, "Who moves to Calgary on purpose?" and laughed for a long time at his own joke. I laughed too, because that's what you do when you've spent your whole life being the punchline in someone else's story. You laugh, you drive away, you don't look back. Calgary suited me. I got a junior position at a property management company in Beltline, learned everything I could, and within 3 years had moved to a mid-sized commercial real estate firm as a leasing associate. The work made sense to me in a way almost nothing else ever had. I understood how spaces held value, how a vacant storefront in the wrong hands became a liability, and in the right hands became something a whole neighborhood built itself around. I met my husband at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital Foundation in 2019. He outbid me on a weekend at a lodge near Banff National Park, and then walked over to apologize, which I thought was the most Canadian thing I'd ever witnessed. We talked for 2 hours. He asked for my number. I gave it to him, which for me was the equivalent of shouting from a rooftop. We got engaged 14 months later. I called my parents the same night. My mother cried. My father said he was proud of me. My brother, who my mother put on the phone without asking, said, "Finally, eh?" And then immediately pivoted to asking whether our parents were going to help pay for the wedding because he'd been having a rough year financially and he didn't want things to feel unequal. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said goodnight and hung up. We set the date for the following September, a Saturday. The venue was a restored heritage property just outside of Canmore. Stone walls, original timber beams, a garden that backed onto the mountains. We'd spent nearly a year planning it. My husband's family was flying in from Prince Edward Island and British Columbia. My maid of honor, a woman I'd met in my first Calgary apartment building and who had become one of those rare constants in an adult life full of variables, had already booked her flight from Toronto. I asked my brother to walk me down the aisle 6 months before the wedding. I already know what you're thinking. But he was my only sibling, and some part of me, the part that still remembered being 9 years old and wanting desperately for things to be different, thought that maybe this was the moment. Maybe this was the thing that would make him show up differently. He said yes. He even sounded genuinely happy about it. He called me 4 days before the wedding. I was at a final venue walkthrough with my coordinator when I saw his name on my phone. I stepped outside. "Hey," he said. "So I've been meaning to call you about this. Things have gotten a bit complicated with work." My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. He'd been offered a contract job, something in Fort McMurray, he said, which paid triple what he was making, and it started the week of the wedding, and he really couldn't say no to this one. You know how it's been. He was sorry. He felt terrible. He hoped I understood. I stood in the parking lot of the heritage property in Canmore and looked at the mountains and did not cry. I asked him if he'd already committed to the job. He said yes. I said okay. I hung up. The wedding was beautiful. My maid of honor walked with me instead. My mother cried the entire time and my father gripped my hand so hard. At the reception I thought he might leave a bruise. Nobody said my brother's name out loud, which felt like its own kind of acknowledgement. Guests kept asking where he was, and I kept saying, couldn't make it in the tone that means please do not ask me anything else about this. What I couldn't say to anyone except my husband that night in our hotel room in Canmore, was that I wasn't just hurt. I was done. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required a confrontation or a speech. Just quietly, completely done. The door hadn't slammed, it had simply closed. I threw myself into work the way I always did when something in my personal life hurt too much to examine directly. Within a year of the wedding, I had left my firm, and together with my husband and a business partner we'd met through Calgary's commercial real estate network, started our own development consultancy. We focused on mixed-use properties, residential above, commercial below, in underserved corridors across Alberta. It was not an overnight success. I need to be honest about that, because so many of these stories skip the part where you eat lunch at your desk for 2 years and lie awake at night, wondering if you've made a catastrophic mistake. We lost a bid on a development in Red Deer that we'd spent 4 months pursuing. Our first major project in Edmonton ran 6 weeks over schedule and ate into margins we couldn't really afford to lose. My business partner and I had exactly one screaming argument in a parking garage on a Tuesday in February that I still trick thinking about. But we figured it out. We hired carefully, grew slowly, and said no to deals that felt wrong even when the numbers looked right. By our 3rd year of operation, we had completed 7 projects across 3 provinces. By our 5th, we were managing a portfolio valued at just over $40 million. I am not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you this because none of it happened in a straight line, and none of it happened because someone handed it to me. And for a long time, the only people who knew how hard I was working were the people in that office with me, every single day. My parents knew I was doing well. We talked on the phone, had dinner when I drove through to visit, kept things warm and careful the way families do when there's something underneath the surface everyone has agreed not to mention. My brother's name came up less and less. I had learned not to ask. I found out through my mother, almost by accident, that he'd left the Fort McMurray job after 6 months, that there had been a series of other jobs since then, each one not quite working out, that he had debt, credit cards, a personal loan he'd taken out from a family friend who was now uncomfortable, and according to my mother, a significant amount owed to a private lender she didn't fully understand. I listened. I did not offer to help, and I noticed with a kind of clinical sadness that my mother never directly asked me to. She was testing, I think. Seeing if I would volunteer, I didn't. What happened next happened quickly. In the spring of my 6th year in business, we closed the acquisition of a commercial corridor in Lethbridge that had been in receivership for 3 years. It was a complicated deal. Multiple creditors, a municipality that had opinions about the redevelopment plan, financing that required us to restructure our corporate holding. The deal made local news because of the scale and because the redevelopment plan included affordable commercial units for small businesses, which was the kind of thing journalists like to write about. The story ran in the Calgary Herald. Then the Globe and Mail picked it up with a profile on our firm. The headline mentioned our portfolio value, which had crossed the $80 million threshold by that point. My phone rang more in the 2 weeks after that article than it had in the previous year combined. Former colleagues. University acquaintances I hadn't thought about in a decade. A woman I'd gone to high school with who I was almost certain had never liked me. And then on a Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing lease documentation at my desk, my phone lit up with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in close to 3 years. My brother. The text read, "Hey stranger, saw the article. Really proud of you. Mom mentioned you might be in town next month. Maybe we could grab dinner, catch up properly? There's actually something I've been wanting to talk to you about." I read it 3 times. There it was. 14 words of warmth, and then there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. Not even a full breath between the compliment and the ask. Not even the pretense of a week's worth of small talk before the hand came out. I showed it to my husband that evening. He read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you want to do?" And I sat there for a long time, thinking about that question. I did not respond to the text that night. What I did instead was call a contact I had at a commercial lending firm in Edmonton, someone I'd worked with on the Lethbridge acquisition, and ask, quietly and carefully, whether the private debt my brother had accumulated was the kind of thing that sometimes came up in their work. It was a long shot. It was actually more of a hunch than a plan. The hunch paid out. The lender my brother owed money to was a small private credit firm that had, in recent months, been looking to offload a portion of its non-performing loan book. The loan associated with my brother was part of a package. It wasn't a huge number, around $42,000, principal and accumulated interest, but it was the kind of debt that, if called in suddenly, would cause real damage to someone without resources. I won't tell you it was an easy decision. I thought about it for 10 days. I talked to my husband, who said almost nothing and let me work through it, which is one of the things I love most about him. I thought about the 9-year-old girl in the kitchen doorway. I thought about the parking lot in Canmore. I acquired the loan. I flew home to visit my parents the following month, just as I'd planned before any of this happened. I told my husband I needed to do this part alone. He understood. My parents were happy to see me. My mother made butter chicken and my father opened a bottle of Ontario ice wine he'd been saving, and we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular. And it was genuinely warm, and I was grateful for it. My brother arrived after dinner. He didn't call ahead, just appeared, which was so completely in character that I almost laughed. He looked older than I remembered. There was something behind his eyes that I recognized as stress. The specific stress of someone who is running out of options and knows it. He hugged me. He said I looked great. He said the article had made him really proud, that I'd always been the smart one, that he'd known I was going to do something like this. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me at the table, and my parents drifted, with it seeming to notice they were doing it, into the other room. For a few minutes we made small talk. He asked about Calgary. I asked about nothing in particular, because I didn't want to open doors I wasn't ready to walk through. Then he said, "So listen, I've been having a bit of a rough stretch. Nothing I can't handle, but there's this debt situation that's kind of come to a head, and I was thinking, with things going as well as they are for you." "I know about the loan," I said. He stopped. I kept my voice level. I told him I knew who the lender was, what the amount was, and that the loan had recently changed hands. I watched his face move through surprise and then some close to calculation. "What do you mean it changed hands?" he said. "I mean I own it now," I said. He was very quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside I could hear my father saying something to my mother in the other room, their voices low and familiar. "You bought my debt," he said. "Yes. Why?" And this was the question I had rehearsed the least, because the answer wasn't clean. It wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was something more complicated and more honest than that. Because I needed to decide what I actually wanted to do with it, I said. And I needed to be the one holding it when I made that decision. He stared at me. "I'm not going to call it in," I said. "I'm going to forgive it. All of it. But I need you to understand that I'm doing this not because you asked, and not because I owe you anything. I'm doing it because I've spent a long time carrying things that didn't serve me, and this is one I want to put down." I reached across the table and set down a single piece of paper, a formal letter from my company's legal counsel confirming the debt discharge. I'd had it prepared the week before. My brother looked at the paper for a long time without touching it. "You could have just sent this," he said finally. "I know," I said. "I wanted to be here when you read it." He picked it up. He read it, and then something in his face shifted. Not into gratitude exactly, and not into shame exactly, but into something quieter than either of those things. Something that looked, maybe for the first time in our shared history, like he was actually seeing me. "I missed your wedding," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, offered like he was putting it on the table between us. "Yes," I said. "You did. That was wrong." I nodded. I didn't fill the silence. I'd spent enough of my life filling silences that belonged to other people. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, holding up the letter. "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to know right now." My mother came back into the kitchen then, with the slightly too bright energy of someone who has been listening from 2 rooms away and has decided that enough time has passed. She put the kettle on. She asked if anyone wanted tea. The conversation shifted, the way conversations in family kitchens always do, toward easier things. I stayed 2 more days. We didn't talk about the debt again. My brother and I didn't have a tearful reconciliation, didn't suddenly become close in the way I think part of me still sometimes wished we could be, but something had shifted. On my last morning, he came by the house early, before I'd finished my coffee. He sat down across from me and said he was sorry. Not for the debt, not for the money, for the wedding, for saying yes and choosing a paycheck over standing beside me on the most important day of my life. I told him I appreciated that. I told him that the door wasn't closed, but that the terms had changed, and that I needed him to understand that from now on, I wasn't going to hold space for him at the expense of myself. He nodded. I think he understood. I think, maybe for the first time, he actually heard me. I drove back to Calgary the next morning with the windows down, even though it was barely above 10 degrees. The foothills stretched out to the west, golden green, the kind of early autumn Alberta light that makes you feel briefly and completely like everything is going to be fine. I don't know what the next chapter looks like with my brother. I'm not sure it matters right now. What I know is that I stopped waiting for him to change before I let myself move forward. What I know is that the life I built out here, the company, the partnership, the home, the man who let me work through everything at my own pace without ever once telling me I was wrong to feel what I felt, that life was mine. I made it. Nobody handed me a single piece of it. And I know this. The most powerful moment of that whole kitchen conversation wasn't when I told him I'd bought his debt. It wasn't the letter. It wasn't even his apology. It was when he finally went quiet, and I didn't rush to fill the space. I just sat there in my mother's kitchen, drinking my tea, and let the silence belong to me for once.